Good afternoon, everyone. It's really my great pleasure and honor to introduce my friend, our guest speaker, President Peter Mathieson. He's the 15th president of University of Hong Kong. He graduated from the University of London in 1983 and got his PhD in 1992. He's a world-famous nephrologist. Still practice? No? Okay. And he served as the president of the Renal Association in 2007. And he's also the dean of the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry of the University of Bristol. He's also the Director of Research and Development of the North Bristol NHS Trust. I know that he's going to move to University of Edinburgh to serve as the president again in January next year. Today, he's going to talk about the power of education to transfer individual and society, to transform the individual and society. Let's welcome Peter, President Peter Mathieson.
Thank you, Panchir. So I'll stand here because then I can control the slides. So it's a very great pleasure for me to be here at, bring it down, sorry, yeah. A great pleasure for me to be here at National Taiwan University. I'm proud that Professor Yang would describe me as his friend. We know each other from a number of meetings that happen around Greater China. So there's a particular meeting where university leaders from Taiwan, from Macau, from Hong Kong, and from mainland China meet once a year. And that's probably the mechanism for us to get to know the most people from Taiwan, because there are many people from Taiwan that attend that meeting. And every year we promise that we'll come to Taiwan, and it's been rather slow. Louise has been trying to get me to come to Taiwan for a long time. Anyway, finally I'm here. So, oh, thank you very much, thanks. It's my pleasure to be here. And as you heard, they asked me to talk about my own career, and I will do that. But the theme, if you like, really, that I wanted to illustrate is the power of education. So I don't really need, in this part of the world, to talk too much about the power of education. Many people ask me what's different about working in Asia compared to my experience working in Europe. And I would say one of the major differences is that people in Asia recognize the power of education more readily and more willingly, perhaps, than people in Europe. And I think that's a great credit to this part of the world. So, as I say, this is the theme is the power of education, but I'll illustrate with my own example. I'm going to say a little bit about the University of Hong Kong later on, but I just wanted to start with this point. So I could make you a long list of the most important outputs of the University of Hong Kong, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to show you a picture. Because in my opinion, the most important outputs of any university are its graduates. And so this is a picture taken in 2014. You can see here am I stuck in the middle of all these students. This is class of 2014. So every year on these steps are called Sun Yat-sen steps. I don't need to explain to you who Sun Yat-sen was. But Hong Kong U is very proud to count Sun Yat-sen as one of our early graduates. He graduated from the College of Medicine, which was the forerunner of the University of Hong Kong. And these are Sun Yat-sen steps where we gather every year for a graduation photograph. So I consider that the most important aspect of a university is to provide the best possible education to its students and to provide the best possible graduates to go and spread the education around the world. So I have 4 slides sprinkled through the talk to describe my own career, and I'll tell you a little bit about it as I go along. So I went to a state grammar school in Cornwall. Now, what a state grammar school means is it means a school where you qualify for entry not because of wealth or because of status, but just because you passed an exam. So you had to pass an exam to get into this school, and it was a state school, which means that it was funded by the government. So it was not a school where you needed to have any particular wealth to become a pupil, and that was important because my family didn't have any wealth, and so I qualified for this school. Cornwall is in the southwestern corner of the UK, the southwestern corner of England. It's a very remote place where the major industries are fishing and tin mining, and students going to school in Cornwall are not really expected to go to university. It's not a very academically driven part of the country. And in fact, when I told my school teachers that I wanted to study medicine, their initial response was to discourage me. Okay, thank you. Because they said to me that getting into medicine would be very competitive, and that maybe I should think about studying something a bit less competitive. But I was determined to study medicine, and I wanted to try and get a place into university. I was the first member of my family to go to university, so nobody in my family before had any university experience. And I studied medicine at the London Hospital. So London Hospital, it sounds like there's the only one hospital in London. In fact, there are many hospitals in London, but this one is called the London Hospital, and it's part of the University of London. And so my medical degree was MBBS, which I finished in 1983. So I then spent 5 years doing what I call basic medical training, again in London, and I ended up becoming a renal registrar. Renal is the word to describe anything to do with the kidneys. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about kidneys because it's my favorite subject. So I became a registrar, which is a sort of middle-level training job in kidney medicine at a hospital called Hammersmith Hospital, which is a very well-known hospital for academic medicine. And I show you this because in 1988, when probably many of people in the audience were not even born, I published my first sort of significant piece of research. This was published in The Lancet, which is one of the top medical journals, and it was published in 1988, and it described a group of patients that we treated with a particular set of drugs for a difficult type of kidney disease. And I show you this because I'll come back to The Lancet in a minute, but this for me was very exciting. This was my first really significant piece of published work, and for many of you that are students or researchers, you'll know that the justification, the satisfaction that you get out of your work is really when it's published and when you start to tell the rest of the world about it. So for me, this was a very significant publication. So after that, I went to Cambridge. So I got a fellowship, a training fellowship from an organization called the Medical Research Council. The Medical Research Council is the government-funded medical research organization, and they provided fellowships for people, clinically qualified people, to do a PhD. And that was a golden opportunity for me because it allowed me to study at the University of Cambridge, and I ended up getting my PhD in 1992. And then after that fellowship, I got a different kind of fellowship, again from the Medical Research Council, which they call the Clinician Scientist Fellowship. And the idea of this was that you could still do some clinical medicine, but actually carry on your research career. And again, that was a great opportunity for me because it allowed me to control my timetable myself. I wasn't dictated by either clinical work or by research. I was able to do a mixture of both, and that was a 4-year fellowship. In 1995, I moved from Cambridge to the University of Bristol as the professor of renal medicine. So again, renal medicine means the study of kidneys, basically. And so in 1995, I was still considered relatively young at that time. I don't feel very young now, but at that time I was considered relatively young. I was 36 years old, which in medicine was relatively young to become a professor. And I moved for a number of reasons. I moved because Bristol was very keen to give me an opportunity. They wanted me to run my own laboratory. They had a very good clinical kidney unit, which is a great place for me to do my clinical work, but they had very little research. And also I was a bit disillusioned in Cambridge. Cambridge is a wonderful university, a fantastic place to study, but I felt I was being controlled by other people. I didn't feel as if I had any opportunity to do what I wanted to do. and a couple of people in particular, my bosses there, were trying to push me in a particular direction that I didn't really want to go. So I decided to leave Cambridge. And the real reason was that it allowed me to indulge my own research interests for the first time. So previously I'd always followed what other people thought was interesting. And I really wanted to do what I thought was interesting. And I'm going to tell you just a little bit about it. So the kidney, the human kidney or the mammalian kidney, is basically a filter. So you know that what the kidney's job is to filter impurities and toxins out of the bloodstream and get rid of them from the body. And it achieves that filtering through this thing here. So this thing here is called the glomerulus. This is a little collection of blood vessels. So the blood comes into the glomerulus through here, goes through this sort of filter, and then the filtered blood comes out of this, the other end, and then this blood vessel here surrounds a tubule coming from the kidney where various things are reabsorbed. So the kidney filters a lot of stuff, and then it reabsorbs some of it, and it gets rid of the things that the body doesn't need. And this is the basic structure that the kidney uses to work. And to me, this is the most interesting part of the human body. Now, Professor Young might think that the lungs are rather interesting, but I don't agree with him. I think the kidney is much more interesting. This is a high-power picture, electron micrograph of one of those things, one of those glomeruli. So this is a blown-up version of a human glomerulus. And it's basically a knot of blood vessels. Each of these little tubes is a blood vessel. And then wrapped around the outside of the blood vessels are these cells, which I think are really rather beautiful. These cells are called podocytes. So these cells have a cell body, and then they have processes, a primary process here, and then a whole series of secondary processes which fit together. They're supposed to look a bit like a zipper on your clothes. And through the slits of the zipper is where the filtration happens. So the blood passes through these channels and is filtered across the wall through these slits. So this is another way of looking at it. This is now a cross-section of the blood vessel. Here's the blood vessel here. Here's the wall. And the gaps between these cells on the outside here are the slits. And if I show you that in slightly higher power, this is what it looks like. So this is the blood side, and this is the urine side. So this is the blood vessel wall. These are the secondary processes which form the slits. Each slit, you can see, has got a membrane going across it. And then this is the basement membrane, and this is the endothelial cell, and this is the blood side. So this structure is the structure that's responsible for the filtering action of the kidney. And when I started studying this, very little was known about the functions, particularly of these cells and these cells. A little bit was known about the basement membrane, but not very much was known about the two cells. And what I spent the next number of years of my life studying was trying to understand these cells and how they work. So in a 70-kilogram adult, 180 litres a day of water and small molecules passes very freely across this wall. Now, you don't pass 180 litres a day of urine, because if you did, you wouldn't have time to do anything else. Most of this, 95%, 99% of this is reabsorbed by the kidney tubules. The water is reabsorbed, and some of the smaller molecules are reabsorbed as well. But this is the mechanism by which the kidney gets rid of waste products. It filters vast amounts of water and takes the waste products out into the urinary space where the urine is later formed. But the interesting thing is that although the kidney allows all this water and small molecules to pass, it doesn't allow any protein to pass. Most blood vessels don't allow protein across their walls. But this blood vessel is specialized to still retain the ability to stop protein, but at the same time allow water and small molecules to pass through. And that's basically how the kidney works. The structures that make up this filter, there's the podocytes, which form these slits on the outside, glomerular basement membrane, and the glomerular endothelium. All blood vessels are lined by endothelium. This endothelium is special in many ways, but I won't have time to talk about that today. And the podocytes are the cells that we primarily wanted to study. And one of the reasons that we became very interested in this subject is because of babies with conditions like this. So this baby was born at Great Ormond Street in London, the Children's Hospital, and it was born with congenital nephrotic syndrome. So congenital means from birth. Nephrotic syndrome is a condition where your kidneys leak protein. And when you leak protein, you get massive swelling. So this baby's got very swollen abdomen and swollen limbs because of leakage of protein. This baby's kidneys are unable to make that distinction between protein and water, and everything leaks out. And these babies die very early because of this massive leakage of protein. And the only treatment that you can give these babies is to remove their kidneys and then give them kidney dialysis, and then when they're a little bit older, give them a kidney transplant. It's a devastating condition. It's quite rare, but the reason it was so significant is that this group, based in Scandinavia, in Finland and Sweden, published in 1998 that this condition was due to a mutation in a single gene, and the only place in the body where that gene is expressed is in the podocyte. So this more or less proved that the podocyte was the cell that normally stops you from leaking protein. And this was very significant. We'd already, at this time, I started studying podocytes in about 1994, so we'd already been studying podocytes for a few years before this. But in terms of proving the significance of this cell, this observation was really important. And the two things that we did at the University of Bristol that really gave us international prominence was that we developed techniques for growing these two cell types. So the podocytes here, we grew in a special technique that allowed them to grow at the temperature of 33, but then when we moved them to the temperature of 37, they stop growing and they differentiate into mature cells. And this had never been done before. It had always been impossible to study these cells in the laboratory, and we basically provided a mechanism whereby you could study these cells. And then later on, we did the same thing for the other cell type, glomerular endothelial cells, using the same technology. So our main contribution really to the world of kidney research was basically to produce reagents. We produced cell lines which we could study, and then we shared these cell lines with hundreds of other laboratories around the world. So at one time, every piece of work that was being done on human podocytes anywhere in the world was being done on cells that were originally derived in Bristol, and we were really rather proud of that. I would love to spend hours telling you about kidney research, but I'm not going to, you'll be pleased to know. My research group stayed in Bristol when I moved to Hong Kong, and they carry on doing a number of different areas of work. So this is about the way the two cells talk to each other. I'm going to show you a little bit about insulin in a second. The endothelial cells, the lining cells, they have special characteristics that we've been studying. We're trying to target those cells in particular ways. And then we're very interested in treatment. We're very interested in the treatment of kidney disease and how the treatments work. Because treatment of kidney disease is not very effective. We don't have very powerful drugs for treating kidney disease. And those drugs that we do have, we don't really know how they work. And so a lot of the research group's work has been on both current therapies and future ones. But the only work I'm going to just show you in a few slides is the work on insulin. So you know that insulin is the hormone which prevents you from getting diabetes. If you have type 1 diabetes, it's because you don't produce insulin. And if you have type 2 diabetes, it's because although you produce insulin, you don't respond to it very well. So insulin is the key hormone for diabetes. And you may also know that diabetes is a very important cause of kidney disease. So the single most important cause of kidney failure in the whole world is diabetes. And so understanding the way in which insulin works on the kidney was very significant to us. And when we were studying these human podocytes, we found, and I'm not going to go into detail about how we found out by accident. Many of the most important research advances in medicine and in other fields happened by accident. And we were studying something completely different, but we found, for various reasons, that these cells respond to insulin. When you treat them with insulin, they take up glucose. And they're not supposed to do that. The only cells that are supposed to do that are storage cells, like fat cells and muscle cells. These are not storage cells. These are functional filter cells in the kidney, and yet they respond to insulin. We looked at all sorts of other control cells, and we found that none of the other control cells from the kidney had any response to insulin. So it's unique to podocytes. And the question really was, does that really matter or not? And the only way we decided we could find out would be to create an animal, a knockout mouse, where this response was abolished. So we know that insulin signals predominantly through one particular receptor on the cell surface, and we know that if cells don't have that receptor, they're incapable of responding to insulin. So what we did, we wanted to manipulate podocytes to allow us to just specifically knock out the insulin receptor just in that cell type. Now, I told you earlier on about the congenital nephrotic syndrome, where there's that child, that baby, has a mutation in a gene that's only expressed in the podocyte. And that's very helpful because there's actually a number of genes, about 20 genes, which are only expressed in the podocytes. So you can pick one of those genes and you can target that cell type very specifically. So we made an animal in which its podocytes had no insulin receptors, but all the rest of the animal was normal. So the only cell that was abnormal was the podocyte. And we called this animal the POD-ERCO, podocyte insulin receptor knockout. Later on, we made an inducible version of this animal, which we called the iPod-ERCO, the insulin-inducible podocyte insulin receptor knockout. So the way you do that is very conventional transgenic mouse technology. So you take a gene which is expressed only in the podocyte, and we did this with two different genes, nephrin, which is the gene mutated in that baby, and podocin, which is another gene also expressed just in the podocyte, and you link that gene to an enzyme called Cre recombinase. So that all the mouse podocytes express this enzyme, Cre. That enzyme on its own doesn't do anything good or bad, it's just a reagent. And then you cross that animal with another animal whose insulin receptor genes have got what's called locked P sites or flock sites either side of its insulin receptor gene. So this animal also is normal. It just has an insulin receptor with a different piece of DNA either side of it. But when you cross these two together, what happens is that this enzyme excises this gene, and it'll only do that in the podocyte because that's the only place where the enzyme is expressed. So you then produce an animal that has no insulin receptors on its podocytes. These animals are completely normal, and the control animals with just the Cre gene are normal. The control animal, that's this one, the control animal with just the flock's insulin receptor is normal. And then the podocyte insulin receptor knockout animal, they're born at normal frequency. They look fine when they're born, and they're fine in the early part of their lives. And importantly, they do not have diabetes, because the only cell in their body which can't respond to insulin is the podocyte. All the other cells can respond normally, so they don't have diabetes. Their blood sugar is normal. But what they do have after a few weeks is they start developing protein in their urine. So these are the control animals. This is a urine sample, no protein, whereas this is a knockout animal. It has protein in its urine. And so knocking out this gene seems to stop the kidney from having that ability to retain protein. And when you look at the spread of animals, these are all the controls, and these are all the knockout animals. They all have protein in the urine to a quite variable extent, but sometimes very high levels of protein, whereas the control animals don't have protein. So this seemed to be a very significant demonstration that just knocking out the insulin receptor gene in podocytes made the animal have kidney disease. And if you follow the animal for long enough, out to 13 weeks, which in the life of a mouse is quite a long time, the animals end up with kidney failure. Their kidneys are small and scarred compared to the normals. And if you look at the filters, those glomeruli of the kidneys, they're very abnormal, they're very thickened and damaged. They can't filter normally like this normal one here. And this looks exactly like the kidney changes that you see in diabetes. So by manipulating a gene only in the podocyte, we seem to have reproduced the consequences of diabetes on the kidney, even though these animals did not have diabetes. Okay, so that's all I'm going to tell you about that piece of work. The other disease I'm just going to tell you 2 slides about is another type of kidney disease where, again, this is the filter of the kidney. Again, this is abnormal. The walls are too thick, so it won't filter properly and it'll leak protein. And this is a different type of kidney disease called membranous nephropathy. I showed you this paper from the Lancet earlier on from 1988. And that disease that we were studying there was this disease, membranous nephropathy, which is a difficult disease to treat. The reason I wanted to make the point about the Lancet is that 25 years later, so you remember that paper was 1988 in the Lancet, and one of the conclusions of that paper was that we should study in a controlled trial this treatment. That original paper was just a small series of patients, not in a proper controlled trial. And one of the conclusions was that we should do a controlled trial to really test in a rigorous way whether this treatment worked or not. It took me 25 years to get the second paper published. So they both published in the Lancet, and I just wanted to illustrate to you that sometimes research takes a very long time, and your hair goes very grey in the meantime. So when I published the first paper in the Lancet, I had no grey hairs. When I published the second paper in the Lancet 25 years later, I had many, many grey hairs. But it takes a long time. And this is just a results slide from that paper, which basically just shows you that the treatment shown in the blue line, the patients do much better. This is survival, kidney survival. The other two treatment groups do badly, whereas this group does very much better. So we showed in a controlled trial that that treatment that we were talking about back in 1988, which we thought was effective, this actually proved it, but it took 25 years to get that evidence. And then the other piece of work we did with membranous nephropathy, which is just published a little bit more recently, is the genetics. So if any of you do any genetics, you'll be familiar with this. This is called the Manhattan plot. So along the bottom here, numbers 1 to 22, because this is the 22 chromosomes, not including the sex chromosomes. So you plot the genes across here, and if you see a series of lines going up here, it tells you that a gene in that region of that chromosome is associated with whatever disease it is you're studying. So this is called a Genome-Wide association study, and it compares people with membranous nephropathy to normal healthy controls. And if you see anything happening here, it shows you that there's some gene which is predisposing to that disease. This result shows you that there are two genes, one on chromosome 2 and one on chromosome 6, which predispose to membranous nephropathy. And this is a very, very powerful effect. This is the p-value up here. So this is 10 to the minus 87. So it's a very, very significant result. This piece of work was a collaboration between a group in France, a group in the Netherlands, and a group in the UK. And the only reason we were able to show this highly significant effect in a relatively rare disease is because we pooled populations from 3 different countries. So we were able to get a very large sample size. And to cut a long story short, this paper was published in the New England Journal. If you have those two genes, you're 78 times more likely to get this disease than if you don't have those two genes. And in genetics, a genetic effect of 10-fold is considered enormous. 78-fold is unbelievably high. So these two genes are very, very powerfully predisposing towards this type of kidney disease. Okay, so that's it for all the data. I'm not going to show you any more science, you'll be pleased to know. But I just wanted to say, what was it that my research career taught me? First of all, my research career taught me the importance of collaboration. The clinical trials that we did and those genetic studies that we did, we could not possibly have done without collaborating with other people. You have to find other people that are interested in similar things, and you have to persuade them to work with you. It's very important. And then teamwork as well. All research is done by teams, especially in medicine. Very unusual in medicine for anybody to do anything on their own. In some subjects, particularly some of the humanities and also mathematics and some of these other subjects, individuals can make very significant research contributions on their own. But in medicine, that's very rare. I also valued the international flavour, both in terms of my research group itself. So by the time I left the UK, we had members from the UK, India, Italy, Libya, Sri Lanka as permanent members of the group, and then a number of other groups as temporary members, and also China. And I'm going to show you in a picture in a second to illustrate the influence of China as well. But not just in the research group itself, but in terms of our collaborators. Because we had these cells that we produced, we started to collaborate with people from all around the world. And some of my more recent papers have been published with authors from 10 or 11 different countries, because we've had lots of international collaborations. And then obviously there are then international forum conferences and whatnot where you can present your research. So the idea of research as being an international phenomenon was very important to my career, and very important, I think, to the advances in research in general. You have to work hard. I don't need to tell you this. It's hard work. Research is very distressing and very demoralizing sometimes, because you have many more failures than you have successes. You have to enjoy the successes because they're rare, whereas failure is much more common. You also have to make your own luck. There's a very famous golfer called Gary Player, South African golfer, who was accused of being very lucky. Someone told him the only reason you're successful is because you're lucky. And his answer was, yes, and the more I practice, the luckier I get. So I think you can make your own luck. You do need a bit of luck in order to succeed in research, there's no question. But actually you can, by hard work and by identifying opportunities, you can make your own luck. And I think it's also important to identify a niche. What I mean by a niche is some area where you know more about it than most other people in the world. And for us, this was podocytes. Our niche was podocytes. We were studying them, we were able to work with them when other people couldn't really study with them. And so this became very powerful, because we became the experts in this particular cell type, which as it's turned out to be quite important. And also seize opportunities. Life is full of opportunities, but you have to be able to identify them and you have to be able to seize them when they come along. This is my research group on a typical sunny day in Bristol. The sun always shines in Bristol. And this was the group just before I left the UK. These are the people that funded our research. But I wanted to just show you two people. So Lan Ni here is from mainland China. She's from northern China. And Lu Jiang here is from Shanghai. And these two people are very significant in the research group. Lan basically was the person who worked out how to culture, how to grow these cells. And she knows more about growing human kidney cells than just about anybody else on the planet. So she was very significant to the group. And Lulu here was very significant because she was my most recent PhD student. So when I left the UK, she was still studying her PhD. So ironically, this person from China I left behind. And I met her at a conference in Germany a couple of years later. And she was very struck by the fact that my name badge said Peter Mathieson, China, and her name badge said Lulu Jiang, United Kingdom. And she thought, I'd never see this day where you come from China and I come from the UK. Okay, so after I moved to Bristol, I started a process of getting more and more involved in administrative or leadership roles rather than purely research roles or purely clinical work. So in 2003, I became deputy head of department. This is called Clinical Science North Bristol. This is one of the subdivisions of the Faculty of Medicine in Bristol. After I did the deputy role for a while, I then became head of department. And as you heard in the introduction, I became research and development director for the hospital, for the NHS Trust. The NHS is the National Health Service. So this is the hospital that I worked in. I was then elected president of the Renal Association. This is the National Association of Kidney Doctors and Scientists in the UK. And at the time I was elected, I was the youngest ever president of the Renal Association. It's the only time I've been the youngest ever anything in my whole life. But I am still, as it currently stands, still the youngest ever person to be president of the Renal Association. So this is rather amusing. And I did that for 3 years. And then in summer of 2008, I became Dean of the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry. I didn't want the job. I'd spent several years trying not to have the job. So back in 2003, my boss in the university wanted me to become dean, and I said no, because I was more interested in getting my research group secure and carrying on doing some of the research that we're doing. But after 5 years, eventually I was persuaded to become dean. I didn't really want the job. I think being dean is a terrible job. You have to manage budgets, you have to give people bad news sometimes. You have to deal with politics, you have to deal with governments, you have to do all sorts of difficult things, which I wasn't properly trained to do. So I never really wanted this job, but anyway, in the end I got it. And the term that I agreed to serve was 5 years. So I was committed to do this for 5 years. As I say, it was a lot of hard work, there were some difficult decisions. In 2008, in the UK, the financial recession started. So I was appointed to the job 2 weeks before the Lehman Brothers crash. So I originally thought I would be wealthy and I would be building new buildings and I would be hiring people and I would be building up this faculty. But in reality, I spent 5 years trying to save money because the recession happened and things got very difficult in the UK, very difficult for the universities, very difficult for the health service because there was not enough money. And so this was a pretty tough job. During that time, I did manage to stay in touch with my clinical work and my research, so I still managed to carry on seeing patients, and I still managed to carry on with my research group. Towards the end of 2012, my boss, who was the same boss that had been trying to persuade me to be dean all the years before, wanted me to serve a second term as dean. And I said no. I said I couldn't face it. I hadn't really enjoyed doing it. It was tough work. I thought I'd done a pretty good job, but I didn't really enjoy it very much. So I said, no, I'm not going to do it. But I said, I'll do 1 more year while you find somebody else. And at that time, I had absolutely no idea what I would do next. But I didn't really care. I just wanted to stop being dean. And then on the 4th of March 2013, I got an email from an organization called Corn Ferry. Now, if you don't know what Corn Ferry is a search firm, a headhunters. And they contacted me in 2013 and said that the University of Hong Kong was looking for a president and they might be interested in me. And I thought they were joking because I have no particular credentials in Hong Kong. I had worked in Hong Kong before, briefly as a visitor, but I didn't really know very much about Hong Kong, and I didn't really think that this was a very serious approach. But anyway, to cut a long story short, eventually they did appoint me, and in April of 2014, I started my present job. And then, as you've heard in the introduction, from January of next year, I'm planning to move to the University of Edinburgh as the principal there. So that's the story of my career. It's all a bit haphazard. There's a few accidents along the way, and there's a few jobs I didn't really want to do. But they served me pretty well. So I think the opportunities that my career has given me have been to broaden my horizons. As you heard, I went to school in a part of the UK where universities were not really something that was expected of you. But because I got an opportunity to study medicine, I ended up having the career that I've had, and it allowed me to pursue the medical profession, which was something I'd always wanted to do. I met my wife-to-be, Tina. So when I say to people that all the good things in my life that have ever happened to me have come through education, it's true, and I can say it because I also met her through education. And we had our 2 children. So literally everything good that's ever happened to me has been a result of that opportunity that I had to go to university. I've traveled the world. I've worked now in different parts of the world. I've met thousands of interesting people. I'm still meeting more interesting people even today. I've met more people in the last couple of days in Taiwan that I haven't met before. So all of this happens because of education. Without education, I'd still be working in a shop somewhere in Cornwall, and I wouldn't have had the opportunities that I've had. I've had the opportunity to contribute to university leadership now in 2 different continents, and ultimately back in Edinburgh again. And what makes me excited about my professional life is that not only have I had opportunities myself, but my role now is to try and provide opportunities to others. And I think of universities as places where future leaders are produced. So in this audience, there'll be some future leaders. In every university audience I ever talk to, there'll be some future leaders. This is what universities are all about. We have to provide the opportunities, and these leaders will then go on to have impacts locally and globally, and I think that's one of the things that makes working at a university so exciting. I'm just going to finish with a few remarks about the University of Hong Kong. So the University of Hong Kong was originally established in 1887 as the Hong Kong College of Medicine, and this was the entity that Sun Yat-sen graduated from. So he was in the first cohort of graduates from the Hong Kong College of Medicine. Hong Kong U is one of the oldest universities in continental Asia, originally established as a university, an English-speaking university for Hong Kong and China, providing a British-style education, and always very internationalized. So the original plan was to have a significant proportion of the faculty as non-Chinese, and until 1963, this was the only university in Hong Kong. We have a research-led ethos, so we're comprehensive, so we have the whole range of subjects. These are our 10 faculties, which, as you see, include medicine and dentistry. We have about 16,000 undergraduates and about 12,000 postgraduates, and we have 3,000 academic and research staff. And of the professors, which is about 1,100, over 60% are from outside Hong Kong. Now, university presidents are always very suspicious when talking about rankings. We always say, Professor Yang and I always say, we don't believe in rankings. But we like rankings when they like us. So this ranking is one that I like quoting. So this is the Times Higher, which is one of the major ranking agencies. They have a whole series of different league tables, but one of their league tables is on international outlook. And in 2016, when this ranking was produced for the first time, Hong Kong U was ranked 3rd in the world for our international outlook. That sounds good, doesn't it? But then you look and see who was 1st and 2nd. So 2nd was the University of Luxembourg, and 1st was Qatar University. You may not have heard of those 2. You will have heard of Cambridge, which was 36th. You will have heard of MIT, which was 90th, and you might have heard of Harvard, which is 134th. So this makes Hong Kong U look pretty good. We're 131 places ahead of Harvard. And the reason for this anomaly is because of the methodology. So whenever you look at a university ranking, please be an academic, be a scientist, and look at the underlying methods. This ranking favors small jurisdictions like Hong Kong, Luxembourg, and Qatar, because if you work in one of those places, you have to collaborate with other jurisdictions because it's not big enough on its own. And also, you're going to get a lot of your staff from other places. So this ranking gives you lots of points if you recruit lots of your staff from outside. Whereas if you're Harvard, you get most of your staff from the United States, and you don't score any points. So it's an anomalous ranking, but nevertheless, we like being third in the world. This was recently updated, so 2017, they've just published the latest version of this ranking, and we're still third in the world. So again, we're quite pleased about that. Now this time, the first and second universities are both in Switzerland. So École Polytechnique Française of Lausanne and the ETH in Zurich are first and second. And the reason for this difference between the 2016 ranking and the 2017 ranking is that they incorporated a measurement of international standing. So these two universities are not regarded as highly regarded international universities, whereas these two are. The great thing for Hong Kong U is that neither of these two are comprehensive universities. These are both focused universities. So Hong Kong U is now the #1 comprehensive university in the world for international outlook. And I like being #1. So all I think you can conclude from this is that Hong Kong U is a very international university. So. But we're not satisfied with our being a very international university. And we've recently spelled out our plans for the next 10 years. And there are 4 words all beginning with I. We call it the 3+1 I's. So internationalization is one of the things we want to further achieve. Innovation and interdisciplinarity. These are all 3 things that we think are very important. And the 4th I, which all of these 3 things contribute to, is impact. So we want impact, and I'll say a little bit about what we mean by that. So just a word about each of these headings. So internationalization, we believe that we should have a very international curriculum. So all of our students, when they're studying at Hong Kong U, will study international aspects of whatever subject it is they're studying. They won't just study local law, for example, we'll study international law. We won't just study local medicine, we'll study international medicine. So all of our curricula reflect that. We have a campus where you'll walk around and you hear many different languages being spoken, because we have students and staff from all over the world, and we try and make sure that the experience that students have at Hong Kong U is a very international experience. We aim to produce globally minded leaders, and part of this is that we want to give every undergraduate student and every research postgraduate student the opportunities to study outside Hong Kong. We've set ourselves the target that by 2019, 50% of our undergrads will be spending time outside Hong Kong, each with 2 experiences, one in mainland China and one somewhere else in the world. At the moment, it's about 40% of our students have an experience outside Hong Kong in the overseas opportunities, but only about 20% spend time in the mainland. So we need to get both of those figures up to 50% by 2019, and then up to 100% by 2022. We think we're the only university in the world that's aiming to have 100% opportunities for all undergraduates and postgraduates, research postgrads outside home. We're doing this in a number of different ways. We've agreed a number of joint degrees with other universities, including University College London and Sciences Po, these 2 here. And then we have a partnership with the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, which is around regenerative medicine. We also have a number of other opportunities for overseas study, which are not joint degrees, but they may be semester exchanges or they may be experiential learning or whatever as well. Under innovation, we're very interested. Everyone, I think, is interested in innovation. Everyone recognizes that innovation is the way forward. We're trying to encourage innovative thinking in all of our students and staff. And again, collaboration, very important in the creation of new knowledge. So we use things like MOOCs and flipped classrooms, which I'm sure you use here at NTU as well. Dreamcatchers is the name of an organization that we've started to try and bring our alumni and bring role models back to the university to talk to our students and staff about innovation, about entrepreneurship, because we want to encourage everybody to think about these methods of furthering their own career and furthering society. We believe interdisciplinarity is very important, so working not just in a single subject, but working across subjects. We have 10 faculties at the University of Hong Kong, and in the past they've all tended to work on their own. What we're trying to encourage is for them to work together. We think that in a comprehensive university this is something that we're very well placed to do. We obviously sit in Hong Kong at the junction between East and West, and this is something that we can exploit. And we're very interested in improving our partnerships with industry and with other universities on research and development. And again, I think all of these things will be very familiar to NTU. And then impact. What we mean by impact really is making a difference in the world. So all of these other things, internationalization, innovation, interdisciplinarity, they should all create impact. And impact can be local, it can be regional, or it can be global. It basically just means making things better, making a difference, having your new knowledge applied in some way that makes an improvement to society. That's what universities should really be driven by. The last aspect of my personal experience I wanted to tell you about is just about Africa. Now, this is a children's map of Africa, pretty colours. Does anybody know where Uganda is? If you want to find Uganda in a map of Africa, you just have to find Africa's biggest lake. Africa's biggest lake is here. This is Lake Victoria. And Uganda is that red country there, sort of wrapped around the top part of Lake Victoria. So Uganda is an East African country that I've visited as a teacher and researcher a number of times over the years. I'm just going to show you a little bit of why I feel that's been very valuable to me. So here's Lake Victoria. This is Uganda wrapped around the top of Lake Victoria. The adjacent countries here are Tanzania, Rwanda and Congo. And the place where I go is called Mbarara, which is a rural city about 6 hours drive from the capital, Kampala. And the thing about Mbarara is that it's a very undeveloped part of the world. Many of the people live in remote villages with no roads to connect them, so you have to travel across forests and grasslands to get to them. In medicine, the typical care that's provided to a rural population in Africa is not through hospitals or through conventional Western drugs or anything, it's through traditional healers, what you might call witch doctors. And these traditional healers are usually consulted first for any medical problem. And people that come to the hospitals have usually only come to the hospitals because the initial treatments haven't been effective. Malaria is extremely common. Just about everybody has malaria. And HIV is also very common. Human immunodeficiency virus. We studied the population there and we found that about 10% of the local population had HIV. And in a hospital population, it's much higher, probably around 40%. And the thing that originally took me to Uganda comes back to the kidney. Someone told me that there's a lot of kidney disease in Uganda, particularly in children. And I was interested to try and understand why. So that was originally why I went. This is the Mbarara University of Science and Technology, MUST. Succeed, we MUST, we must. That's their motto. They're very proud of these gates. And I've been there as a teacher. You can see in those days I had a moustache, and I was a little bit slimmer. And these students are very attentive, very good students, not like British students, maybe a bit more like Taiwan students. But they were teaching, I was teaching them about medicine there. And I've also done some research here. We tried to understand why this kidney disease was so common in Uganda. And I'm not going to show you any results of that, but basically we found a type of kidney disease that's not been described anywhere else in the world that was occurring just in this region of Uganda. The first time I went to Uganda, which was in 1999, I arrived right at the end of an Ebola outbreak. So you've heard of Ebola. Ebola is a viral infection which is almost uniformly fatal. It's a very, very nasty disease. These people work for the WHO, the World Health Organization, and they, when there's an Ebola outbreak, these people parachute in and set up a hospital and provide isolation and try and prevent the epidemic from spreading. In Uganda, that works extremely well. You'll know that a couple of years ago there was an outbreak in West Africa, in Guinea and in Liberia, which was not successfully contained, probably because the WHO got there a bit late. Whereas in Uganda, they're always there on time. Ebola is a very, very frightening disease. Unfortunately, in African hospitals, death is a very common feature. This coffin maker has his stall right outside the hospital. So, and you can see that some of the coffins are small. because a lot of children unfortunately die, usually from malaria or diarrheal disease. You'll also notice that all the coffins have got a window. And the reason they've got a window is that when you die in Africa, it's considered very important for you to go back to your home, wherever you come from, in order to be buried. But many of these people are far from home. And so if they die in hospital, they want, the family wants to take them back to their hometown to be buried. But in Africa, you know, obviously it's hot, bodies don't keep very well. And so by the time several days have elapsed, by the time you travel back, the body would not be in great condition for you to be able to be seen by your relatives. So they leave a little window so that at least they can see that it is their loved one. And this is also very important in the management of Ebola, because one of the reasons why Ebola spreads is that in Africa it's very important to hold the dead body, to cuddle them, to wash them, to look after them after they've died. And obviously if they've died from Ebola, that's a pretty powerful way of transmitting the infection. So the other reason for these windows is to allow them to see their loved ones, but not touch them. And that actually, these were introduced around the time of Ebola. And the point I just wanted to make is that for me, going to Africa and working in a hospital ward where patients have Ebola was pretty scary. And I describe it as getting outside my comfort zone. And I actually think there was enormous educational value for me personally of going to work in a part of the world where facilities were much less well developed than I was used to. I was dealing with diseases that I knew nothing about, malaria, HIV, and Ebola. For me, this was a great experience in terms of getting outside my comfort zone. And actually, I think one of the reasons why students benefit from spending time away from Hong Kong, away from their home, is because you go to a place that's outside your comfort zone, and I think that has real value. And certainly for me personally, I think my experience in Uganda has been really developmental. So this is what we're aiming to do at the University of Hong Kong, provide whole person education, with opportunities overseas, internships, as well as modern forms of classroom teaching. We value student activities. We've got a residential provision for some of our students, unfortunately not all of our students because we don't have enough residences, but we'd like to have more. And we have a lot of social activities for the students as well. So we're very interested in not just the classroom. For example, we cherish some of our students that have major achievements outside the classroom. This is Hailey Chan, who won the gold medal in windsurfing at the Asian Games in Incheon in 2014. And we hoped that she would go to the Olympics in Rio and bring back an Olympic gold medal, but unfortunately she had some problems in her training, so she didn't go, but she tells me she's going to win a gold medal next time. So she's a superstar, happens to be a Hong Kong U student, but actually we celebrate her achievements outside the classroom. And then we do a number of other things. I'm just going to show you one illustration. So the Mingda projects are a group of engineering students predominantly that go to an ethnic minority population in rural Guangxi, so this is a very isolated part of mainland China, where they've built schools and hostels for school students. And this has been a fantastic project for these students. It's contributed to the local society as well, in that it's produced infrastructure that they wouldn't otherwise have. But actually the main value for us is for the students and staff who find this very developmental and very empowering. So they're going to a part of the world that they would never otherwise visit, and they're doing some good. And this to us is the kind of project that we want our students to undertake. So my take-home messages then are that universities provide transformative opportunities for their students and staff, and in my case also for me. So I thank my opportunity for going to university for everything that's happened to me since. At the moment in the world there's quite a lot of anti-globalization and anti-intellectual rhetoric, some of it coming from President Trump, but some of it coming from other places in the world as well. And I think the universities have a moral and social obligation greater than ever before to try and counter this, and to try and say why we think globalization matters. I'm personally resolutely committed to globalization. I believe it's the right future for my university, and I believe it's the right future for all universities, and I know that NTU also believes this. And I think we, as university leaders, we have to have the collective courage to take a longer-term view. We mustn't allow some of these short-term things to deflect us from the overall goal. And if you want some reading material, I'd recommend reading this. This is a UNESCO report from 2013, and it's called Education Transforms Lives. It's a very interesting document, And these are the headings in the document which tell you the various ways in which education can transform lives. And I'm not going to go into it now, but for all sorts of things that you might not predict would be direct results of education. So for example, education saves mothers' lives, and then the mother's education saves the children's lives. And maternal education improves child nutrition. So aspects of society that you wouldn't necessarily deliberately advocate education to improve child's health or nutrition. Actually, there's very good evidence that education does improve those things. Education increases women's and men's job opportunities. It certainly increased my job opportunities. But it works for both men and women, actually particularly for women in the developing world. Education reduces child marriages, it reduces early births. Educated people in general are more tolerant, and more equal education leads to faster economic growth. So, and education leads to greater concern about the environment. So all sorts of ways in which we can make the world a better place can be directly attributed to education. That was all I wanted to say, and I just remind you that the most important outputs of the University of Hong Kong are our graduates. Thank you very much.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Louisa Chen, Vice President for International Affairs and also Professor of Spanish Literature of Department of Foreign Languages and Literatures.
And my friend.
Yeah, we are so honored and delighted to have President Peter here to give a wonderful and insightful and touching talk. Just take it a kind of a motto of our life. Education transforms lives. So now we will have 30 minutes for Q&A. So after listening to President Peter's speech, I think you have a lot of question, curiosity, and especially in particular to share, not share with you, but he shared with us his personal experience as a medical doctor, to president of Hong Kong University, and now back home to Edinburgh, now of UK. So now we open to your questions, and you must ask him in English. Okay,
yes,
please.
my Putonghua is not very good, so it has to be English, I'm afraid.
Here.
In the beginning of the presentation, thank you very much for your speech. I really like it.
Before you ask the question, maybe you can introduce yourself. Where are you from?
My name is Gerald. I'm doing global MD in NTU. So, Mr. Mathieson, you was talking about kidney. You know, not a lot about kidney. So, Chinese people, totally different interpretation about disorder. Well, you said kidney is kind of filter in our body. Chinese people, actually including people from Taiwan, we believe it's actually source of power, source of energy. So, my question is, in your point of view, what's your personal point of view about Chinese medicine in general? Because there's a discussion going on in China and Taiwan saying that Chinese medicine is kind of fake science. With double blind tests, with the A/B test, with the random test, So, in your personal point of view, is it kind of traditional healers with the result in Uganda, or system?
Okay, so if anybody else didn't hear the question, it's about Chinese medicine. Several things to say. I mean, if I talk about Uganda first, so when I talk about traditional healers, my experience of traditional healers is that there are some things that they're extremely good at, and there are some things which they're not so good at. And part of the problem for Uganda is resources. So if you live in a remote village in Uganda, you might like the idea of going off to some fancy hospital and having a CT scan or getting the modern drugs, but you're not going to have access to that. You're really only going to have access to what's available. And so for the traditional healers, they can do a lot of good in some areas. Now, there are some things that they can't cope with, and those patients often in Uganda either die or suffer great disability. They may be fortunate enough to be transferred to some part of the country where they can get access to more sophisticated care. But I'm very respectful of some of the things that the traditional healers can do. And one example is epilepsy. So epilepsy, which is fits, in Africa is regarded with great suspicion. And actually someone with epilepsy is often regarded as possessed or damaged in some way. And traditional healers are very good at treating epilepsy, mostly with plant products. There are some very effective drugs in the form of plants. And actually the management of epilepsy is quite successful in Uganda, even without access to sophisticated medical care. So that's just one example. If you then transfer to China, I mean, my dominant feeling about Chinese medicine is that I don't understand most of it. I don't have sufficient knowledge to know whether things are very effective or things are not effective. And part of the problem is lack of standardization. And so many Chinese medicines are taken in combinations, and they're often prepared in ways that are not standardized. So it's a bit of this and a bit of that, and you boil it up or whatever. So I don't really know what the dose is. I don't really know the risks and benefits. And so my view about Chinese medicine is that I suspect that there are many, many very effective therapies, but I just don't actually know. And I think if China is going to convince the rest of the world that Chinese medicines are safe and effective, then they have to be subjected to standardization. So we have a hospital in Shenzhen, just across the border in the People's Republic of China, and in that hospital we have one pharmacy for Western medicine and one pharmacy for Chinese medicine, side by side, dispensing drugs or dispensing Chinese medicines in standardized packets, standardized dosages, so that we can study the two types of medicine together. And I personally think that that kind of study is needed in order to really find out for sure about which medicines are effective and which ones are not. And then the only other thing I'd say about Chinese medicine, and it's particularly in relation to the kidney, is that virtually no medicine is free of side effects. All drugs have some potential side effects. And unfortunately, in the Western world, about 10 or 12 years ago, there was an epidemic of kidney failure, which ultimately was shown to be due to a herb present in Chinese medicine. And that was a toxic substance which actually caused irreversible kidney damage. And that episode gave Chinese medicine quite a bad reputation in the West, because people become very concerned about toxicity rather than efficacy. But as I say, it's not confined to Chinese medicine. All drugs have potential side effects, and I think that's another reason for proper study, is to balance the risks and the benefits. I suspect there's many, many undiscovered drugs available in Chinese medicine which could be very effective, not just in China but to the rest of the world, but they need to be properly studied.
Well, this question is quite professional, right? Well, try to be brief your question, okay? The second one. And before he asks, I would like to share, actually, NTU, with our public health, they also work with some African country.
Thank you for your very insightful presentation, Professor Mathieson. I'm Dr. Susan Chen. I'm from the College of Public Health. I joined the College of Public Health 2 years ago, and before that I worked in Hong Kong University for 3 years. And before that I studied my PhD in Bristol University.
Wow.
So,
you're my blood brother.
But I'm not following you to Edinburgh. So my question is about higher education. So given your experiences in Hong Kong, and you mentioned about niche and opportunity. So what would your advice for higher education institutes, universities in Asia? What would your advice about niche and opportunities for universities in Asia?
Okay, so it's a really good question. I mean, I think what I would say is that I think universities in Asia have fantastic opportunities to really lead the world. And you only need to look at some of the rankings to see the way this is going. In the most recent Times Higher rankings, in the top 4, 2 of them are Chinese, Tsinghua and Beida. And the universities in this part of the world are making great progress. And I think that's fantastically exciting for this part of the world. In terms of niche, if you look at the way Western universities are approaching Asia, they all want to have some activity here. They want to recruit students from this part of the world, but they also want to be here. They want to be present in China and in other parts of Asia. And they find it difficult. They don't really know where to go. They don't know really how to start. They don't know how many staff to employ. So I think for universities like NTU and indeed Hong Kong U, we have a huge advantage because we're here already. We already know how this part of the world works. We can actually work with other parts of Asia much more effectively than the Stanfords or the Harvards can. So I think we need to seize that opportunity. And I think for Hong Kong, it's important that politics don't stop us from seizing those opportunities, because that's the risk. The risk is that politics gets in the way.
More? Okay, here.
President Mathieson, I have a question about kidney. I don't really understand the mechanism behind insulin and why does it cause the protein to pass through. And so, and another question is...
You need to come and work in my laboratory for a few years.
Another question is, you didn't really enjoy the dean job. Maybe it was due to the timing of the financial crisis, or I don't know, but seems like the president job or the principal job is even tougher than the dean job in terms of politics and management. I'm not too sure if you enjoyed it. It seems like you enjoyed it, that's why you continue to be president or the principal of a university. So.
Okay, so they're two really good questions. I mean, the point about insulin, the reason I make the point about insulin is that what that experiment shows you is that this cell is really, really important in the function of the kidney. If you stop the cell, this just one cell type from responding to insulin, the kidney fails. And that's probably what happens in diabetes, because the cell can't respond to insulin for whatever reason, either because there is no insulin or because the cell doesn't respond to it. And what we're trying to prove with that experiment is that this cell is the most important cell in the kidney, and we think that that's what that shows. So it's not that the whole kidney needs to respond to insulin, but in order to do its job, its filtering job, stopping protein, the podocyte needs to be able to respond to insulin, and if you stop it responding to insulin, it fails. And so we think that's really fundamental in terms of understanding why diabetes is such a bad thing for the kidneys. In relation to your second question, it's a good question. I mean, I regard becoming deputy head of department in 2003 as the start of what I would describe as a slippery slope, where when you're on a slippery slope, you can't go back up again. You know, you slide down, and there's no way back up again. And so, in a way, I took a decision to move into a more administrative role, leaving behind my research and my clinical work. And at the time, it seemed like the right thing to do, but once you've made that decision, you're more or less committed to it. You can't really go back. And so I have to make a success of it. So although I say I didn't enjoy being dean, that's true, I did get satisfaction from doing the job effectively, because it was difficult. It was in a recession, I had a number of problems to deal with. And I get satisfaction from solving problems. That's basically why I became a kidney doctor, I think. Because kidney disease is difficult, and if you can make your patients' quality of life and length of life better, then you get satisfaction out of that. And I bring the same approach to being a university president. It's not necessarily fun, and there are certainly major challenges, but you can get satisfaction from doing a good job. And for me, the major satisfaction, as I showed in my last slide, my major satisfaction is the quality of people that the university produces, because I think then we're doing a good job.
Here. Okay, more question about higher education, since it's a thematic today.
Good afternoon, President. It's my great pleasure to see you here because I'm from HKU. I'm a current year 2 student. Now I'm a visiting student here in NTU. I'm a Bachelor of Social Sciences student, and I double major in China Studies and Exercise Science. That's the reason why I respect medical workers a lot. And my question is simple. When I just went to university, it surprised me that a lot of university governors are medical scientists. And what do you think, what are the advantages of medical scientists to be university governors rather than arts or social sciences scholars?
Okay, so typically from Hong Kong U students, a very good question. I don't know the answer. I think it's quite a recent phenomenon that you've seen more medical doctors becoming university leaders. A few years ago, it was not very common. Nowadays, it's more common. So you have Professor Yang, your NTU president, is a medical doctor. Tan Cho Chuan, who's the president of National University of Singapore, is a kidney doctor like me. Joseph Sung at Chinese U is a gastroenterologist. There are many, many medical doctors who are now in university leadership. And I think I'm probably not the right person to comment because I'm biased, but I think medical doctors generally have good communication skills because I think you have, in order to succeed in medicine, you have to be able to communicate. And actually, as a university president, a big part of the job is communications. So I think actually that may be one reason. The other reason is that medical doctors are trained in giving people bad news. And that's sometimes useful when you're a university president, because sometimes you have to say things to people that they don't really want to hear. And so I think there may be some characteristics of medical doctors that make us suitable. But I don't think it's not a generalized phenomenon. I mean, there are many talented university presidents that come from other very different disciplines. One other point you make, which I think is a really interesting one, is that they tend to be from hard sciences. So they tend to be engineers or physicists or chemists very often, not so much from the humanities. And I personally think that's a weakness. I think actually we should take more people from the humanities. And I always think of a quote that was made in, we were hiring a new dean at Hong Kong U, and someone on the panel asked him why the humanities matter. And his answer was, the sciences tell us what we should know, and the humanities tell us why we should care. And I think that's quite a powerful way of analyzing the role of the humanities. And I think those skills will be very useful in university presidents as well. So I think the fact that there's been a tendency to favor hard science is probably a bad thing.
But Peter, what you have mentioned just a kind of my thought, because that might be a crisis of higher education. You know, all the best students go to study medicine, then you know money can talk. Now higher education also need a lot of time and money, so you are talking about the humanities. So what the humanities scholars are the way to go? Can you give us some suggestion? Because they say humanities is a kind of spirit.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, the humanities, they have different needs to the hard sciences. You know, you don't need laboratories, you don't necessarily need big research grants, you don't necessarily need hundreds of PhD students. You know, so the needs are different. And I think the important thing for universities, I believe in the comprehensive nature of university. I don't think any one part of the university is more important than any other. And I think there's a tendency for medical schools to sometimes think they are more important than anybody else. And I don't agree. So I think the role for people like me is to make sure that the universities cherish humanities and social sciences and give them the same opportunities, because I think they make an important contribution to the comprehensive nature of the university.
More question? Yeah. Sorry,
Chen King from College of Public Health, National Taiwan University. I would like to ask, I'm very interested in your talk because I remember Dr. Clark Kerr, previous president of the University of California. He was also appointed as a board member in University of Hong Kong. And he came to Hong Kong to do some things to give a suggestion from the board meeting. As your Hong Kong, University of Hong Kong actually is so internationalized, I would like to ask you several questions. Number one is, what are the major requirements for outstanding university president, since you have experience? Second is, in the 21st century, we all know that different disciplines need to collaborate, as you mentioned so well. And anything you have done for promoting interdisciplinary collaboration, because I understand that the University of California, Berkeley, they have some kind of mechanism through the vice president trying to do something. So I was trying to learn your experience. The third one is, I would like to know what are your major achievements during your president leadership time for the University of Hong Kong. Because for me, I think it is very hard for a foreigner to lead a university with so much Chinese culture and also had some kind of political campaign, student political campaign during that time. The last two questions is, what are the major difficulties you have encountered during your leadership time? The last one, the most important one is, I would like to know the philosophy of education from the president viewpoint.
So number one was the qualities of a university president. Number 2, I've already forgotten what number 2 was. What was number 2? Yeah, how do you make interdisciplinarity? Number 3 was major achievements, number 4 was major challenges, and number 5 was philosophy of education. So the qualities of a university president, I mean, I think you have to be strong. I think if you're weak, you'll fail. And so I think you have to be strong. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means you have to know what it is you believe in, and you have to be prepared to follow those beliefs and stick to them. I always say that my wife says I'm stubborn, but I call myself consistent, because that sounds better. But I think I am stubborn. I think if I've got something I really believe in, then I think I'll really stick to it, and I won't be deflected from it, and I think that's quite important. You have to just balance that with one other thing, is that you must be prepared to listen, because you won't always know all the answers. And universities are full of clever people, and there's often somebody that knows the answer better than you. And I think that's a very important characteristic. So for me, the ability to be principled, to be strong-willed, but also to be able to listen, I think is basically what I would say is required. Interdisciplinarity, I believe that very often in universities or in businesses in general, money drives behaviors. One of the problems at Hong Kong U previously was that we had 10 faculties with 10 individual budgets, and each budget was protected. And so nobody really wants to share their budget with anybody else. And so what we've done is we've top-sliced some of the budgets and kept it centrally, and then allocated it to interdisciplinary projects. And we're trying to engineer behaviors using money. And I think that's actually probably just about the only tool I've got available to me. I mean, I actually believe that interdisciplinarity is better for both education and for research. And most people will believe that, but making it happen, you have to promote the behaviors that you want to see, and you can quite often do that by influencing the budget. Major achievements, again, I don't think it's really for me to say, but I consider it an achievement to have led Hong Kong U through quite a difficult period in its history, with major political challenges, the student protest in 2014, which happened just after we arrived. That could easily have blown the university off course, and I don't consider that it did. I think we had to provide strong leadership during that period, and I take some pride in the fact that we managed to do so with our principles intact, supporting our students and staff, but also encouraging them to respect the law and to respect other people's opinions. I think it was a good opportunity to restate the important principles of a university, and I believe we came through that period quite well. We've also put in place quite a lot of reforms. The University of Hong Kong is a rather old-fashioned university with rather old-fashioned ways of doing things, and those have served it very well in its 106 years of history. But we've modernized quite a lot of the procedures, quite a lot of the things around how accommodation is allocated, how staff promotions are assessed, all these kinds of things. And I think we've introduced quite a lot of modernization, which I hope will help over the next few years as well. So maybe the achievements will become more obvious after I've gone. Major challenges, well, I guess politics again. Media, you know, the level to which the media in Hong Kong are interested in the most boring aspects of a university is quite incredible. You know, I mean, we've had front page stories. There was a time when the Olympics was going on, there was war in Syria, there was international incidents, you know, terrorism going on around the world, and the newspapers in Hong Kong thought the single most important story in the world that day was some staffing reforms that we were doing at Hong Kong U. You know, unbelievable that they would give that level of priority. And for me, that was a revelation. I just didn't expect the media to be that interested. And again, I try and turn it into a compliment. I think the reason that people care about Hong Kong U is because education is valued, and Hong Kong U is seen as a very important institution. And so for us, this has to be a compliment, but it certainly makes life more complicated. And then the last question was about philosophy of higher education. I think I've tried to cover some of that. I mean, basically, I think it's about taking talented people and giving them opportunities and supporting them whilst they pursue those opportunities. And this is one of the reasons why we believe in having all of our students spend time outside Hong Kong, is because during their university course, that's one time when they can do it in a sort of protected environment without necessarily having families to support or other things they can support. We can provide them with opportunities, and they'll just fly. If you give people opportunities, they will flourish. And I think that's the main philosophy for me of higher education.
I would like to add one point. Maybe it's not enough to be strong, but be brave.
Or
okay,
stupid.
we have another student.
Hello, thank you, President Mathieson. I am an MA student in International Relations. And so my question is, well, Hong Kong is in a very interesting position between China and it's a kind of a bridge between the Western and Eastern international relations. So my question is, in recent years, China has been criticized by many Western governments for medical issues, human rights issues regarding medical ethics. So my question is, do you, like you said, you suffer, Hong Kong suffer or encounter any political difficulties in medical ethics education? Thank you.
So it's a very good question, and I mean, I'm not very involved with medicine in Hong Kong because my job's to run the whole university, not just the medical school. But I do some teaching on the medical ethics course at Hong Kong U because I think it's something that I know something about. If I was to pick one example from my own experience, I'd pick organ transplantation. So in kidney medicine, a very important aspect of providing proper kidney care is to be able to give kidney transplants. And there's a lot of regulation around who can be a kidney donor and who can't. And one of the areas in which China has been criticized is for its policies around organ donors, with allegations being made of people being, prisoners, executed prisoners being used as organ donors against their will or against their family's will. And about 2 years ago, legislation was introduced in China which was to ban the use of prisoners as organ donors. Now, I don't know how effective that's been, but I do believe in that principle. I do think that organ donors should be organ donors of their own free will, not because someone else imposes it on them. I'm not actually against organ donors being paid if it's the donor that receives the money rather than some intermediary. I think everyone does have 2 kidneys, and if your 2 kidneys are healthy, you can afford to lose one of them to somebody else. And that there is a need for kidney donation. So actually there's a place for payment of organ donors, but unfortunately in places like India and Pakistan where this is quite well developed, it's not usually the donor that receives the money. The donor will receive some money, but actually some intermediary will receive most of the money. And I don't approve of that. So I think there's progress to be made on medical ethics all around the world, including in China. But some of the recent developments, like the banning of use of prisoners, I think is a step in the right direction.
Okay, we can accept one more question, the last one. Okay, you too. Can you ask together?
Okay, I just introduced myself, and I'm a sophomore student from Shanghai. So I just want to ask you 2 simple questions, okay? So the first one, what is the most important motivation for you to continue your study in medical research? And the second one is, there is a common phenomenon in China that many parents are helping their children to find out what they're interested in when they're really young. Because a lot of children, they can't even know what their interest when they enter the college. So how did you find that you are interested in your field? And when did you find it? Thank you.
Okay, if you answer the last one, I'll try and answer the 3 together.
Hi, Mr. Mathieson. In your hometown and in your generation, I think higher education was definitely something that was rare. But if you fast forward to nowadays, it's almost, in most developed societies, a given. And at the same time, employers in the job market continuously complain about a dearth of necessary technical skills to basically a slowing global economy and continuously lowering productivity. So what do you think is the place of the university in the face of this issue, and how would you approach it as a university president?
Okay, great questions again. What was my driving force in taking forward my medical research was the first of your 2 questions. I mean, I cannot tell you how exciting research can be. I mean, if you discover something, if you think you've found something that's new, or something that somebody else didn't previously know, and you've discovered something, that's incredibly exciting. That's happened to me 2 or 3 times in a career of 30 years. It's not common to have that feeling. But when you have that feeling, it's very, very powerful. It really drives you forward. So I think when I was quite fortunate in the early part of my research. I had some success when I was working in Cambridge. And that's very intoxicating. You want more. It's almost like a drug. You know, you publish papers, people are interested in your papers, people call you or email you or write to you from around the world and say they're interested and will you come and talk to them about your research. That's a very powerful feeling, and I think it's very exciting. And I think you can get that in any field. You know, it doesn't have to be medicine, it can be anything, because there's always going to be somebody else that's interested in your work if you're doing something meaningful. So I think part of it was the sense of being a pioneer, trying to discover something new, and then when you discover something new, it's a very exciting feeling. And that to me was a driver. I was also always driven by the fact that I had a clinical background, so I knew that the diseases that we were studying were not very well treated, and if we could understand them better, we could improve the treatments. And for me, that was always a very powerful motivator as well. You said about Chinese parents wanting to encourage their kids to know what they should study or what they should take an interest in. I honestly can't tell you when I first felt that I wanted to do medicine. I can tell you the story. When I was at school, the only thing I was really good at was languages. And I used to think I would study languages. But then I decided I didn't want to be a teacher. And I thought if you study languages, your main career is probably going to be as a teacher. That was wrong, I think. But anyway, that was what I thought. And I didn't want to be a teacher, mainly because I saw the way we treated our teachers, and I didn't think I wanted to be treated like that. So I decided I don't want to be a teacher. So the only other thing I was any good at was sciences. And so I thought, well, in that case, I'll study sciences. And what can I do with sciences? Well, I could go and be a teacher, but I don't want to do that. Or I can do a profession of some sort. And so I think I thought about studying medicine for really quite superficial reasons. I wanted to do sciences. I wanted it to be directed in a particular pathway rather than just left open for study science for science's sake. And so I think medicine seemed to me as an appealing career. And I also think when I initially didn't receive any encouragement, I think that was quite a powerful motivator as well. I decided I was going to try and prove them wrong and see if I could study medicine. So actually I think it was a combination of those things. Within medicine, there's many different specialties within medicine that you can choose. I decided when I was a student that I found kidney medicine very interesting. And I decided that I would quite like to do that. And then I spent the next 3 or 4 years doing a number of other specialties to see whether any of them appealed to me more than kidneys, and the answer was they didn't, and so I went back to kidneys. So I think the kidney sort of specialization happened when I was a medical student. But the desire to do medicine was a number of years earlier, probably when I was choosing my A-levels, so when I was about 14 or 15, I suppose. And I'm thankful that for whatever reason, I had some idea of what I want to do, because I don't know really where it came from, but I'm grateful for it. In terms of the question about universities and employment, I mean, this is a huge issue that we spend a lot of time talking about. You'll be aware that particularly in the United States, there's been quite a lot of drive, particularly to the public universities, to change their curricula and to think, instead of producing students with a broad education, we should be producing graduates who are prepared to work in one particular profession or another. I'm against that. I think universities should provide broad education. I think that's what we're good at. And the main argument for that viewpoint is that if you look at university graduates of today, most of them will do several different jobs in their lifetimes. They may end up doing something completely different to what they studied at university, and something completely different to what their first job is after leaving university. So it's calculated that in North America, your average university graduate will have 7 different jobs in his or her lifetime. And so you actually, when you leave university, you don't really know what you're going to be doing 20 years later. So I believe that what universities should do is equip people to adapt. So we equip people with techniques for learning and how to use information. These days there's no shortage of information because you get your information from these things. Universities used to be one of the few places where you could get information. Nowadays you can get information everywhere. So what universities have to do is teach people how to use information and how to adapt. And I think if you do that properly, then you can be flexible in the workforce. I'm not in favor of channeling university education to the needs of the job market, because I think it's artificial. We have vocational training schemes, and we have apprenticeships, and we have other mechanisms whereby you can get specific training in a trade or a profession. I think universities should still be practicing general education for its values.
Okay, last but not least, well, I would like to know what will be your vision and mission when back to UK? What kind of opportunity you can provide us?
I don't really know very much about the University of Edinburgh yet. I mean, I'm learning about it, but it's a university. It's a research-intensive university with great credentials in terms of research. It is quite strong in medicine. Its strongest subject is actually computer science. So one of the things that the University of Edinburgh has done very well is bring together its two greatest strengths. So it's bring together medicine and computer science, and using big data to try and improve population health, all these kinds of things. So I think that's an area that the university is quite strong in. I think the university needs to be more international. And I think that's one of the reasons why they're interested in me, because of my experience in this part of the world. I also think that there's some quite complicated politics for the UK, with Brexit and the possibility of independence in Scotland. So, I'm not leaving behind political complexity in my new job. But I think, again, to sum it up, basically it's about making the most of opportunities. I think the University of Edinburgh has got a fantastic history. It's 430 years old. It's got a huge legacy, but it also needs to adapt to the modern world, and it needs to seize the opportunities that are available. And I happen to believe that a lot of those opportunities will be in Asia. So I hope to promote greater linkage between Scotland and Asia.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll apologize for such short time, but we do enjoy today's speech. Let's give Peter a big hand again.